A cruel millionaire threw hot coffee on his wife. This action cost him everything when his wife started. The chandelier in the Wheeler dining room cast fractured light onto the long mahogany table, its surface gleaming like glass. The air was thick with the scent of roasted lamb and the sharp tang of red wine. Charlotte Wheeler adjusted the napkin on her lap, her hands moving mechanically, her mind elsewhere. Carl's voice filled the room, commanding as always. His laughter came in calculated bursts, a polished echo that rippled through the dinner guests. And of course, that deal was closed before the ink even dried. "A signature is just a formality when you negotiate like I do," he said, his tone dripping with pride. The guests, local politicians, board members, and their well-coiffed spouses, laughed obediently. Charlotte glanced at him, her lips forming a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Charlotte," Carl's voice snapped her back. "Darling, refill Senator Wills's glass, won't you?" She hesitated for a moment, startled, then rose gracefully from her seat. The silk of her dress whispered against her skin as she moved to retrieve the wine bottle. Carl's eyes lingered on her for a beat too long, a silent warning not to falter. "Your wife is quite the hostess, Carl," said one of the guests, raising his glass. Carl smiled, tight-lipped. "She has a knack for keeping things orderly, a necessary skill in a home like this." Charlotte poured the wine, careful to keep her movements steady, ignoring the faint hum of humiliation that rose in her chest. Kelly's voice pierced through from the far end of the table. "Charlotte, dear, you forgot the bread rolls earlier. Did you not think they were worth serving, or was that just another oversight?" The room stilled momentarily, and a flicker of a smile danced on Kelly's lips, the kind that didn't belong to someone trying to be kind. "I'll bring them right out," Charlotte said, her voice soft but steady. Kelly continued, leaning back in her chair, emphasizing the importance of paying attention to detail. Her diamond earrings caught the light as she twirled a strand of her perfectly styled hair. In a home like this, appearances matter. Don't you agree, Carl? Carl didn't answer immediately, swirling his wine instead. "Of course," he said finally, his tone as cold as the silverware beside him. "Charlotte knows that." The words sat heavy in the air, more verdict than statement. Charlotte nodded and excused herself, stepping into the kitchen. The kitchen was a stark contrast to the opulence of the dining room. Stainless steel counters gleamed under fluorescent lights, and the faint aroma of garlic lingered. Charlotte gripped the edge of the counter, the cool metal grounding her. She allowed herself a brief moment to breathe before pulling the basket of bread rolls from the oven. Her reflection in the glass of the oven door caught her attention. She looked like she belonged, her hair sleek, her makeup pristine. But the person staring back at her felt unfamiliar. "Charlotte!" Kelly's voice rang out, sharp and impatient. Charlotte inhaled deeply and returned to the dining room, placing the basket carefully at the center of the table. "Ah, there they are," Kelly said, smiling sweetly, the insincerity dripping like honey. Carl's eyes flicked to Charlotte, then away. "Finally," he murmured under his breath. The evening dragged on, with Carl regaling the guests with stories of his business acumen and Kelly chiming in with snide remarks disguised as jokes. Charlotte remained at the periphery, pouring wine, adjusting plates, her presence acknowledged only when needed. When the dinner finally ended, the guests filtered out, leaving echoes of polite laughter and empty glasses. Charlotte stood by the grand front door, her smile fixed in place as she bid each one goodbye. As the last guest stepped out, Carl shut the door with a decisive click. "Next time, don't let Kelly run circles around you like that," he said, his tone devoid of warmth. Charlotte didn't respond, only nodded. Kelly sauntered past, a smirk on her lips. "Good night, Charlotte. Try not to forget the bread rolls next time." Charlotte stood in the empty hallway, the faint ticking of the grandfather clock, the only sound. The grandeur of the Wheeler mansion seemed to loom over her, every polished surface and ornate detail a silent reminder of her role. She glanced at her hands, the skin faintly red from the hot oven tray. They looked strong, capable, yet the weight they bore felt immeasurable. As she climbed the sweeping staircase to her room, she allowed herself a fleeting thought, a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Perhaps, someday, she would no longer need to play this part. The morning sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of the Wheeler mansion, painting delicate patterns on the marble floors. Charlotte stood at the threshold of Kelly's room, holding a small bucket of cleaning supplies. The faint aroma of lavender lingered in the air, masking the tension that seemed to seep from the walls. Kelly reclined on a velvet chaise, scrolling through her phone, her legs crossed elegantly, as if she were royalty. She barely glanced up. "Charlotte, could you start with the vanity? The maids didn't even bother to dust properly last time. It's disgraceful." Charlotte nodded silently, her lips pressed into a thin line. She moved toward the ornate vanity table, its surface cluttered with perfume bottles and jewelry, each piece gleaming like trophies. As Charlotte wiped the marble surface, Kelly let out a dramatic sigh. "You know, Carl should really reconsider bringing someone into the family who doesn't understand the importance of appearances," Kelly said. "It's not personal, Charlotte, but this house, it's a legacy. You can't expect to fit in just because you married him." The words landed like stones in Charlotte's chest, but she kept her gaze fixed on her task. She picked up a framed photo of Kelly, carefully cleaning the edges, her movements precise and controlled. Kelly's voice continued, sharp and cutting. "Oh, what's this?" She reached across the room, plucking a delicate silver locket from the tray Charlotte had brought to clean. "That's mine," Charlotte said softly, her tone steady but firm. Kelly held the locket up to the light, studying it with exaggerated interest. "This? It looks so quaint. Where did you even get it? A flea market?" "It was my mother's," Charlotte replied, her grip tightening on the cloth in her hand. Kelly smirked and let the locket dangle from her fingers. "Charming. But wouldn't it look better here?" She draped it over a porcelain jewelry stand on her vanity, ignoring Charlotte's outstretched hand. Charlotte opened her mouth to speak, but Kelly dismissed her with a wave of her hand. "Let's not make a fuss. You don't want Carl to think you're being petty, do you? It's just a trinket." The weight of the words pressed down on Charlotte, the same as always. Her voice failed her, and she returned to her cleaning, her hands trembling slightly. Behind her, Kelly scrolled again on her phone, oblivious or perhaps reveling in the silence. Later that afternoon, Charlotte sat in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm tea. The polished surfaces around her gleamed, a testament to the house's rigid perfection. But no matter how much she scrubbed or polished, nothing ever felt clean enough here. Her thoughts drifted back to the early days with Carl, a man who had once seemed so full of promise. She remembered the small apartment they had shared when they first married, where sunlight warmed the walls, and the sound of Carl's laughter was real. One quiet evening, as they ate dinner on mismatched plates, he had told her, "You're my world, Charlotte. One day, I'll give you everything." But everything had come with a cost. The mansion, the wealth, the parties, all of it had built walls between them, each brick laid by Carl's ambition and Kelly's entitlement. Charlotte's eyes wandered to the corner of the counter, where her resume lay tucked beneath a cookbook. She had spent hours the night before crafting each word, imagining a version of herself that still held value outside these walls. Her fingers ached to leave this house, even for a day, and enter a world where her husband's name no longer defined her. "Charlotte," Carl's voice boomed from the hallway, breaking her thoughts. She stood quickly, setting the teacup down with a clink. Carl appeared in the doorway, his tailored suit pristine as always, his eyes scanning her with quiet disapproval. "Kelly says you're making her uncomfortable. Something about an argument over jewelry." "It wasn't an argument," Charlotte replied, her tone measured. "She's my sister," Carl interrupted, his voice low but sharp. "If she wants something, give it to her. You're making things unnecessarily difficult." Charlotte stared at him, her words trapped in her throat. Previously, she had admired his decisiveness and ability to command attention, but now it felt like a blade aimed at her. "I'll handle it," she murmured finally, her gaze dropping to the floor. Carl nodded, satisfied, and turned to leave. When the room was quiet again, Charlotte exhaled slowly, her shoulders sinking under the weight she carried. She moved to the counter and pulled out the resume, her thumb brushing over the edges of the paper. Her reflection caught her eye in the window above the sink. She saw the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the tightness in her jaw. But beneath the weariness, there was something else, a flicker of determination. Her mother's locket was gone, but the memory of her mother's voice lingered in her mind, soft but unwavering. "You deserve better than this." The Wheeler mansion was unusually quiet when Charlotte slipped into the study that evening, her resume clutched tightly in her hand. The dark wood-paneled walls seemed to close in as she eased the drawer open, sliding the paper beneath a stack of unused stationery. The faint scent of leather and old books hung in the air, a testament to Carl's curated image of sophistication. Tomorrow. The word rang in her mind like a promise. She had confided in Martha earlier that afternoon, stealing a precious half hour at the cafe near the park while Kelly was out for a shopping spree. Martha had listened, her brows furrowed with concern, as Charlotte spoke in hushed tones about her growing restlessness, her longing to escape the suffocating confines of her life with Carl. "You're more than just his wife, Charlotte," Martha had said, her voice steady and warm. "You always were. You're the one who used to talk about writing a novel, about traveling the world. That's still in you. It's not gone." Charlotte had smiled weakly, her fingers gripping the porcelain coffee cup as if it might anchor her. "It feels like a lifetime ago." "Then let's start small," Martha had urged, leaning forward. "This interview, it's a step, a door opening. Walk through it." Now, back in the suffocating silence of the Wheeler home, Charlotte replayed her friend's words. Small steps. She could do this. The next morning, Charlotte descended the sweeping staircase, her polished flats clicking softly against the marble. The house was already buzzing with activity. Kelly's laughter floated faintly from the dining room. "Charlotte!" Kelly called as Charlotte entered the room. She was lounging at the breakfast table, an untouched croissant on her plate, her phone in hand. Carl sat at the head, glancing at the morning paper with a cool detachment. "Good morning," Charlotte said, her voice light but practiced. Carl's eyes flicked up briefly, his gaze lingering just long enough to take in her neat blouse and understated makeup. "You're up early," he remarked, his tone unreadable. "I have some errands to run," Charlotte replied, smoothing the fabric of her blouse. Kelly arched a brow, setting her phone down. "Errands? You've been spending a lot of time out lately. I hope you're not neglecting your responsibilities here." Carl folded the paper, his movements deliberate. "What errands exactly?" Charlotte hesitated, her mind racing. She had rehearsed this moment in her head, but under Carl's scrutinizing gaze, the words faltered. "Just a few things I need to take care of," she said finally, keeping her tone neutral. Carl leaned back in his chair, exchanging a glance with Kelly. Then, almost imperceptibly, they switched. Elle est si mystérieuse, n'est-ce pas? Kelly said, her tone dripping with amusement. She's so mysterious, isn't she? Carl smirked. Oui, mais tu sais, les secrets ne durent jamais. Yes, but you know, secrets never last. Despite the familiar shift in language, Charlotte maintained a neutral expression. It was their habit, this exclusionary game they played. Kelly leaned forward, her voice light and teasing. Do you understand, Charlotte? Or should we slow it down for you? Charlotte met her gaze, holding it for a moment longer than usual. I think I got the gist, she said softly, then turned toward the counter, where the coffee pot hissed faintly. Behind her, Kelly laughed. Oh, she's learning, Carl. Carl said nothing, though Charlotte felt his eyes on her as she poured her coffee. Later, Charlotte stood in the foyer, her bag slung over her shoulder, her hand resting on the doorknob. She needed to go prepare her personal documents for the interview, of course not in this house. But just as she opened the door, Carl's voice rang out from behind her. Charlotte. She turned slowly, masking the flicker of fear that sparked in her chest. He approached her with measured steps, his face unreadable. Where are you going? Errands, she said, her voice steady. His gaze dropped to her bag. What's in there? Just a few things I need, she replied, tightening her grip on the strap. Carl stopped inches from her, his hand brushing against the bag's edge. I hope you're not hiding anything from me, Charlotte. I don't like surprises. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. You don't need to worry. For a moment, they stood in silence, the tension between them thick enough to suffocate. Then Carl stepped back, his expression softening into something almost condescending. Be quick. Kelly and I have plans tonight, and I expect dinner to be ready on time. Charlotte nodded, slipping out the door before he could say more. That evening, after dinner had been served and cleared away, Charlotte found herself in the study. The room, with its dark wood paneling and heavy bookshelves, had always felt oppressive to her, but tonight it was her sanctuary. She sat at the desk, pulling her resume from her bag and folding it carefully into an envelope. As she sealed the envelope, the door creaked open behind her. Working late, are we? Kelly's voice dripped with mock sweetness. Charlotte stiffened, but didn't turn around. Just organizing some papers. Kelly's heels clicked against the floor as she sauntered into the room. You've been awfully quiet today. Not planning to run off anywhere, are you? Charlotte forced a neutral tone. Of course not. Kelly leaned against the edge of the desk, her gaze sharp. You know, Carl doesn't like surprises. It would be wise to keep him informed of everything. Charlotte met Kelly's eyes for the briefest of moments before looking away. I'm sure Carl has more important things to worry about than me. Kelly smirked. Oh, Charlotte, you really don't understand your place, do you? Charlotte said nothing, her fingers brushing against the envelope hidden beneath her notebook. Kelly straightened, smoothing the fabric of her dress. Good night, Charlotte, she said with a parting glance that felt more like a warning. As the door closed behind Kelly, Charlotte let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She clutched the envelope tightly, her heart pounding. Tomorrow, she thought again. Tomorrow she would reclaim a piece of herself. She turned toward the window, where the moonlight cast faint shadows across the room. In its quiet glow, Charlotte allowed herself a moment of hope. Whatever came next, she was ready to begin. The morning dawned crisp and pale, the kind of day Charlotte had always found invigorating, once. Today, though, the air in the Wheeler mansion felt stifling. She moved quietly through the kitchen, her thoughts racing as she prepared for her interview. Her resume was tucked securely into her bag, a fragile beacon of hope in the otherwise suffocating reality of her life. "Charlotte," Carl's voice cut sharply through her thoughts. He stood in the doorway, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his tie knotted with precision. "Breakfast. Now." She hesitated, glancing toward her bag on the counter. "I was just about to—" "Now," he repeated, the finality in his tone brooking no argument. Charlotte swallowed her frustration and nodded, setting a pan on the stove. She instinctively cracked eggs into the sizzling butter. Carl's presence loomed behind her, and she could feel his gaze heavy on her back. "Make sure it's done right," he muttered, taking a seat at the table. Kelly sauntered into the kitchen moments later, her robe cinched tight around her waist, a self-satisfied smirk on her lips. She took her place beside Carl, lazily scrolling through her phone. "Charlotte," Kelly said lightly, "don't forget the coffee. It's not like you have anywhere else to be." Charlotte bit the inside of her cheek, focusing on the task at hand. She plated the eggs and slid them onto the table, the clatter of the dishware louder than it needed to be. Carl cut into the eggs, his movements deliberate. His knife scraped against the plate as he lifted the bite to his mouth. He chewed once, twice, then paused. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice low but dangerous. Charlotte froze. "What do you mean?" "They're runny," he snapped, shoving the plate away. The eggs, glistening with butter, slid precariously toward the edge of the plate. "How many times do I have to tell you how I like them? Are you incapable of listening?" "I apologize," Charlotte uttered, her tone barely audible above a whisper. Carl pushed back from the table, standing abruptly. His towering frame cast a shadow over her as he stepped closer. "Sorry doesn't fix this. It's the simplest thing, Charlotte. The simplest thing." "Carl, it's just eggs," Kelly chimed in, her voice lilting with mock concern. "But honestly, Charlotte, maybe you should write it down next time." Charlotte felt her cheeks burn, a mix of anger and humiliation tightening in her chest. She reached for her bag, intending to slip away, but Carl's hand shot out, gripping the strap. "What's this?" he asked, his tone icy. "It's nothing," she said quickly, but her heart was pounding. Carl yanked the bag open and pulled out the neatly folded resume. His eyes scanned the page, his expression darkening with each word. "What is this?" he hissed, holding the paper up as if it were evidence of a crime. You were planning to leave?" His voice rose, sharp and cutting. "To go behind my back after everything I've given you?" "It's not like that," Charlotte stammered, her voice trembling. "Then what is it like?" Carl demanded. Carl's anger erupted before she could respond. He snatched the coffee pot from the counter, the dark liquid steaming within. In a single motion, he hurled it at her. The hot coffee splashed across her shoulder, the searing pain stealing her breath. She stumbled back, clutching her arm as tears sprang to her eyes. "You ungrateful," Carl began, but Charlotte's voice cut through, shaking but resolute. "Enough." Carl froze, his eyes narrowing. "I'm done," she said, each word measured. "I'm done with this house, with you." "You're not going anywhere," Carl growled, but Charlotte was already moving, her bag clutched in one hand as she stumbled toward the door. Her shoulder throbbed with each step, but she didn't stop. The front door slammed behind her, the sound echoing in the stillness of the morning. Charlotte arrived at Martha's apartment, her body trembling with adrenaline and pain. Martha opened the door, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of her friend. The coffee-stained blouse, the burn on her shoulder, the raw emotion in her face. "Charlotte," Martha said, her voice thick with concern. "I can't stay there anymore," Charlotte whispered. Martha pulled her inside, wrapping an arm around her gently. "You don't have to. You're safe now." Later, after Charlotte had cleaned up and bandaged her shoulder, Martha sat beside her on the couch. "There's someone you need to meet," she said, her tone firm. "Jennifer Adams. She's a lawyer. She helps women in situations like yours." Charlotte hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the mug in her lap. "I don't know if I can fight him, Martha. He's powerful." "You don't have to do it alone," Martha said softly. "Jennifer will help you. And so will I." For the first time in years, Charlotte felt a flicker of hope. It was fragile, like the first light of dawn breaking over a long, dark night. But it was there, and she would hold on to it. The sterile calm of Jennifer Adams' office was a sharp contrast to the chaos of the past few days. The pale grey walls, punctuated by framed diplomas and certificates, exuded a quiet authority. Charlotte sat stiffly in the leather chair across from Jennifer, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Jennifer leaned forward, her expression both focused and kind. "You've taken the hardest step, Charlotte. Walking away isn't easy, but it's necessary. Now, we focus on the next part." Charlotte glanced at the folder on the desk, her resume tucked neatly inside alongside documents Martha had helped her gather. It was a tangible reminder of the life she was trying to reclaim. "Carl isn't going to make this easy," Charlotte murmured. "He won't let me go quietly." Jennifer's lips pressed into a firm line. "He doesn't have a choice. The law is clear on these matters, and his money can't change that. What we need is your resolve. And from what Martha's told me, you've got plenty of that." Charlotte straightened slightly in her chair, a flicker of determination surfacing beneath her lingering fear. The first legal notice went out the next day. Charlotte stayed at Martha's apartment, her days punctuated by Jennifer's phone calls and emails detailing the next steps. Carl's response came swiftly and predictably. A sleek black car pulled up outside Martha's building late one afternoon, and a sharply dressed man emerged, a briefcase in hand. "He sent his lawyer," Martha muttered, peeking through the blinds. Charlotte's stomach tightened, but she nodded. "Let him." The lawyer's tone was smooth, almost practiced. "Mrs. Wheeler, my client has asked me to convey his deep disappointment regarding your actions. However, he is open to resolving this matter amicably, provided you reconsider your position." Jennifer, standing by Charlotte's side, cut in. "Let me be clear. Mrs. Wheeler's position isn't up for negotiation. We're proceeding with the divorce. Any further communication should go through me." The man's smile faltered. He left shortly after, but Charlotte could feel the weight of Carl's anger looming in the distance. The weeks that followed were filled with meetings and filings. Carl did everything in his power to stall the process, leveraging his wealth and influence to intimidate and obstruct. "You'll never win this," he sneered during a court-mandated mediation session. His tone was quiet enough for only Charlotte to hear, but the venom in his words was unmistakable. Charlotte didn't flinch. She met his gaze, her voice steady. "I don't need to win, Carl. I just need to be free." Carl's eyes narrowed, but Jennifer's calm, commanding presence at Charlotte's side kept him in check. The final hearing was set for a brisk morning in late autumn. Charlotte sat in the courtroom, her hands trembling slightly despite the warmth of Martha's reassuring grip. Jennifer presented her case with precision, her arguments dismantling every attempt Carl's team had made to discredit Charlotte. Evidence of his financial control, verbal abuse, and recent physical outburst painted a damning picture. Carl sat rigid, his jaw clenched as the judge addressed the room. Given the evidence presented, the court finds no reason to deny Mrs. Wheeler's petition for divorce. Furthermore, the court orders Mr. Wheeler to provide financial compensation as outlined in the agreement. The words swept over Charlotte, both overwhelming and liberating. She felt Martha's hand squeeze hers, a silent reminder that this victory was real. That evening, Charlotte returned to Martha's apartment. The relief hadn't fully settled in, but there was a lightness in her step that hadn't been there before. "You did it," Martha said, setting 2 mugs of tea on the coffee table. Charlotte smiled faintly, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup. "I'm still trying to believe it." Martha leaned back, her expression soft. "What now?" Charlotte glanced at the pile of papers on the table, the finalized divorce documents, a new lease agreement for a small apartment across town, and her resume, waiting to be sent out again. "Now," she said, her voice steady, "I start over." Martha smiled. "And this time, it's on your terms." Charlotte nodded, feeling a slight relief from the weight of the past. For the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar and exhilarating. Freedom. The road ahead would be long, she knew. There would be challenges, and the scars Carl had left, both physical and emotional, would take time to heal. But for now, she allowed herself to savor the moment. She had taken the first step toward a life that was hers alone, and no one, not Carl, not Kelly, not the world they had built around her, could take that away. Do you think the act of decisively breaking free from the darkness and fighting hard deserves to be honored? Leave a comment, egg tart, to show your support. Always love yourself a lot. A few months later, Charlotte arrived at her parents' house on the edge of a small, sleepy town, surrounded by rolling hills and quiet streets lined with maple trees. The late autumn air was cool, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke. The house, modest and warm with its ivy-covered brick exterior, stood in stark contrast to the imposing grandeur of the Wheeler mansion. Her mother greeted her at the door, arms open wide. "Charlotte," she said softly, pulling her daughter into a tight embrace. Charlotte sank into the warmth of her mother's arms, letting herself exhale for what felt like the first time in years. "Hi, Mum," she whispered. Her father stood just behind, his smile gentle but tinged with concern. "Come in, honey. You must be exhausted." The days that followed were quiet, filled with simple routines that felt strangely foreign. The mornings began with the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of her mother humming in the kitchen. Afternoons were spent on the back porch, watching the trees shed their leaves in golden bursts. It wasn't long before Charlotte found herself reaching for an old notebook tucked into one of her boxes. Its pages were blank, save for a few scribbled ideas she had jotted down years ago. Writing had always been a dream, a spark she'd buried beneath the weight of Carl's control. One crisp morning, she sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, a steaming mug of tea at her side, and opened the notebook. Her pen hovered over the page before she began to write. The first sentences came haltingly, like stepping onto ice after years away from skating. But as the words began to flow, Charlotte felt something shift inside her. She wrote about her own pain, of course, how the locket her mother had given her had been taken, how coffee scalding her skin had been her moment of liberation. But she also wrote about other women. She thought of the stories Jennifer had shared, a mother escaping with her children, a young woman rebuilding her life after years of financial abuse, an immigrant struggling against cultural expectations and control. Each story wove itself into the pages, blending fact and fiction into something cathartic and powerful. By the end of the day, the notebook was no longer blank. Charlotte's parents noticed the change almost immediately. "You look lighter," her mother remarked one evening as they sat together in the living room. "I feel lighter," Charlotte admitted, her fingers brushing over the edge of the notebook resting on the coffee table. "Writing, it helps." Her father nodded thoughtfully. "It's good to see you finding your way again, sweetheart." Charlotte smiled, but her thoughts were already drifting back to her pages. Weeks passed. and the notebook filled. Charlotte began to type her work, spending long evenings at her father's old desk with the sound of her mother's favorite radio station playing faintly in the background. The act of transforming her handwritten words into something polished, something real, felt both terrifying and exhilarating. One evening, she sat back in the chair and stared at the screen. The draft of her novel was finished. It wasn't perfect, she knew that, but it was hers. Martha was the first person Charlotte shared it with. She sent the manuscript via email, her fingers trembling slightly as she hit send. The reply came the next day. "Charlotte, this is incredible, honest, raw, and brave. You have to do something with this." Encouraged by Martha's words, Charlotte researched small publishers and literary agents. Her hands trembled again as she submitted her manuscript. But this time, it was from excitement, not fear. The days stretched into weeks, but Charlotte didn't let herself dwell on the waiting. She spent her time rediscovering the woman she had once been. She walked through the woods behind her parents' house, read books she had long forgotten, and even joined her mother at a local knitting circle, laughing for the first time in years. When the email came, Charlotte almost didn't open it, afraid of what it might say. But curiosity won out, and she clicked on the message. "Dear Ms. Wheeler," it began, "thank you for submitting your manuscript. We found it deeply moving and would like to discuss the possibility of publishing it." Charlotte stared at the screen, her heart pounding. For the first time, she felt like she was finally reclaiming her voice, her story, and her life. Her parents celebrated with her that evening, their small dining room filled with warmth and laughter. As Charlotte clinked her glass with theirs, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The scars Carl had left, both physical and emotional, were still there, but they no longer defined her. Through writing, through her family's love, and through her own strength, Charlotte was discovering who she truly was. And this time, she was determined to hold on to it. The first time Charlotte noticed something was wrong, it was subtle. A comment from an old friend, phrased casually, but layered with meaning. "I heard you've been busy," they had said, their tone careful, eyes darting toward her over a coffee cup. "Busy?" Charlotte replied, her smile faltering. "Your book," the friend continued. "And well, everything Carl's been saying." Charlotte's breath caught, but she forced herself to remain calm. "What exactly has Carl been saying?" The friend hesitated, then shook their head. "It's probably nothing. People like to talk, you know." But it wasn't nothing. Carl Wheeler had always been a man who thrived on control, and losing it didn't sit well with him. The divorce had humiliated him. Charlotte's novel, a thinly veiled account of her struggles, had only intensified the situation. It had gained traction quickly, readers lauding its raw honesty and resilience. For Carl, the success wasn't just an insult, it was an attack on his carefully curated image. He sat in his study, the room dark except for the faint glow of the computer screen. Beside him, Kelly perched on the armrest of his chair, scrolling through her phone. "She's embarrassing us," Kelly said, her voice dripping with venom. "Everyone is talking about it. Everyone." Carl's jaw tightened. "She thinks she can walk away and smear my name? That she can just win?" Kelly turned her phone toward him, displaying an article praising Charlotte's book. "This isn't just about her. People will start questioning us, our family. If she's the victim, what does that make us?" Carl's fingers drummed against the desk. "We'll handle it." Kelly smirked. "Good, because I won't let her drag us down with her sob story." The attacks began subtly. First, there were whispers, rumors planted in social circles about Charlotte's dishonesty and exaggerations. Then, anonymous comments appeared online, calling her story fabricated accusing her of being a gold digger who had married Carl for his money. Charlotte tried to ignore it, but the comments found their way to her. Each word was a small, sharp cut, reopening wounds she thought she'd begun to heal. "They're just words," Martha told her during one of their late-night calls. "Don't let them get to you." "I know," Charlotte said, though her voice wavered, but it wasn't just words. One afternoon, Charlotte returned home to find her parents' mailbox stuffed with envelopes. At first, she thought they were fan letters, but as she opened them, her stomach turned. Liar. Homewrecker. We know the truth. The handwriting varied, but the message was always the same. Her mother found her sitting on the porch steps, clutching the pile of letters, her face pale. "Charlotte, what's wrong?" Charlotte held up the letters, her hands trembling. "He's trying to destroy me." Meanwhile, Kelly's paranoia began to spiral. "I saw her on the news again," she snapped one evening, pacing Carl's study. "They're calling her inspiring. Do you know how ridiculous that makes us look?" Carl didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the screen in front of him. "She's laughing at us, Carl. While we're stuck here cleaning up her mess, she's out there basking in it." Carl leaned back in his chair, his expression cold. "Then let's remind her who she's dealing with." The escalation came swiftly. A false story appeared in the tabloids, accusing Charlotte of plagiarizing her novel. Another article painted her as a manipulative ex-wife who had capitalized on Carl's generosity. Jennifer called immediately. "This isn't a coincidence, Charlotte, it's coordinated." "I know it's him," Charlotte said, her voice raw. "But how do I stop it?" "We'll file a cease and desist," Jennifer replied. "But you need to prepare yourself. Men like Carl don't back down easily." Charlotte felt the weight of those words long after the call ended. The moment of crisis arrived late one night. Charlotte was in bed, her laptop open, when an email arrived. The subject line read, "We're watching." Her heart pounded as she opened it. Inside was a single line of text. "Stop, or you'll regret it." Attached was a photo of her parents' house, taken from the street. Charlotte's blood turned cold. She called Jennifer immediately. "This is harassment," Jennifer said, her voice firm. "We'll get the authorities involved. He has crossed a boundary." As the investigation commenced, Charlotte grasped the gravity of the situation beyond her initial expectations. Carl wasn't just trying to discredit her. He wanted to break her. But as terrifying as the threats were, they also ignited something within her. "I'm not running," she told Martha one evening. "Not this time." Martha nodded. "Good. Because you're stronger than him, Charlotte. You've already proven that." Charlotte glanced at her notebook, now a source of both solace and strength. She had fought too hard to let Carl take this from her. The next morning she sent an email to her publisher. "Let's move forward with the next printing. If Carl wanted a fight, he would get one." But this time, Charlotte wasn't fighting alone. The air was heavy that night, thick with the kind of silence that made even the smallest sounds seem amplified. Charlotte sat at her desk, typing away on her laptop. The clack of keys was rhythmic, soothing even, as she worked on notes for her next project. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows across the quiet neighborhood, and the faint hum of cicadas filled the air. She didn't notice the figure lurking just beyond the edge of the driveway. Carl's frustration had turned into obsession. Every avenue he had taken to ruin Charlotte's reputation had failed to stop her growing influence. The book's second printing had garnered even more praise, and Charlotte was quickly becoming a symbol of resilience and empowerment. "She's untouchable in the public eye," Kelly hissed, pacing the room. "No matter what we do, People eat up her sob story. It's disgusting. Carl sat back in his chair, his expression grim. Then we cease adhering to their regulations. Kelly froze mid-stride, her eyes narrowing. What does that mean? It means we make her regret crossing me, Carl said coldly. He picked up his phone, his voice lowering as he made a call. Handle it. Tonight. The figure moved closer, sticking to the shadows. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, with a cap pulled low over his face. He carried himself with practiced ease, each step deliberate as he approached the side of the house. Inside, Charlotte stretched, unaware of the danger outside. Her parents were asleep upstairs, and the steady glow of her desk lamp created a small bubble of warmth in the otherwise darkened house. The sound of a car engine broke the stillness, and headlights swept across the street. The figure hesitated, retreating slightly into the shadows. Arthur Moreno, a patrol officer, was making his routine rounds through the neighborhood. His sharp eyes caught the flicker of movement near the side of the house, and his instincts kicked in. He pulled his cruiser to a slow stop, his hand hovering over the radio. The figure froze, sensing the presence of someone nearby. Arthur stepped out of his car, his boots crunching softly against the pavement. "Hey," he called out, his voice firm. "What are you doing?" The man bolted. Arthur was quick to follow, his flashlight cutting through the dark as he pursued the suspect down the narrow street. "Stop," he commanded, his voice echoing through the quiet neighborhood. The suspect turned a corner, but Arthur was faster. With a well-placed tackle, he brought the man to the ground. The hitman struggled, but Arthur's grip was ironclad. "Got you," Arthur muttered, pulling out his handcuffs. As he secured the suspect, Arthur noticed something sticking out of the man's pocket, a printed photo of Charlotte's parents' house. Charlotte was startled by the knock on the door. It was well past midnight, and her first thought was of her parents upstairs. She hurried to the door, peeking through the small window before opening it cautiously. "Officer?" she said, her voice laced with confusion. Arthur stood on the porch, his presence solid and reassuring. "Are you Charlotte Wheeler?" "Yes," she said slowly. "Is something wrong?" Arthur held up the photo he had confiscated from the suspect. "I need to speak with you about this. May I come in?" Charlotte stepped aside, her heart racing. As Arthur explained what had happened, her hands tightened around the back of the chair she was leaning against. "A hitman," she whispered, the word foreign and terrifying in her mouth. Arthur nodded. "He's in custody now. He confessed that he was sent to intimidate you, or worse, and he mentioned a name." Charlotte's breath caught. "Carl." Arthur's expression softened slightly. "You're safe now, but I'd recommend staying somewhere more secure for the time being. This isn't something we take lightly." Charlotte nodded, her mind reeling. "Thank you, officer, for everything." Arthur's gaze lingered for a moment, steady and reassuring. "It's my job." "But Charlotte—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "This man's actions aren't about you. They're about control. Don't let him take more from you than he already has." The confession was enough to launch an investigation into Carl. Within days, the news broke, and Carl's carefully constructed world began to unravel. After a prolonged period, Charlotte sensed a shift in her circumstances. The fear that had gripped her for so long was starting to loosen its hold. Arthur checked in on her regularly, his presence a steady reminder that she wasn't alone. And as the days passed, Charlotte began to find strength in the knowledge that Carl's reach could no longer hurt her. She sat at her desk one evening, staring at her manuscript. The story she had been afraid to write now felt like a lifeline, not just for herself, but for others who needed to see that survival was possible. With a deep breath, she began to write again, her words steady and sure. Charlotte felt truly free. The courtroom was packed, the buzz of hushed conversations filling the air as people awaited the proceedings. The media had descended on the trial in full force, drawn by the scandal surrounding Carl Wheeler, once a respected businessman, now disgraced by accusations of abuse and a connection to a hitman. Charlotte sat at the plaintiff's table with Jennifer beside her, her posture straight and resolute. Her gaze flicked to Carl, seated across the room, his face unreadable. Kelly sat behind him, her usual haughty confidence replaced with a forced neutrality that barely masked her discomfort. The room quieted as the judge entered, and the trial began. The prosecution presented their case meticulously. Arthur Moreno testified first, recounting the night he apprehended the hitman and the evidence linking him to Carl. "I found this photo," Arthur said, holding up the image of Charlotte's parents' house. It was in the suspect's pocket, along with a note indicating a monetary exchange. When questioned, he confessed that Carl Wheeler had hired him. Gasps rippled through the audience, and Charlotte felt a wave of nausea. Despite knowing the truth, hearing it laid out so plainly was jarring. The defense tried to discredit the testimony, but the hitman's recorded confession was irrefutable. "I was hired by Carl Wheeler," the hitman said in the video, his voice steady, almost resigned. "He wanted me to scare her. Maybe worse. I don't know how far he really wanted it to go." Carl shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the video played, his lawyer leaning in to whisper urgently. Kelly was called to the stand next, her demeanor faltering under the prosecution's questions. "You were aware of your brother's actions, weren't you?" the attorney asked. Kelly hesitated, glancing nervously at Carl before answering. I didn't think he'd go this far." "So, you knew he intended to harm Charlotte Wheeler?" Her face flushed. "He was angry. She humiliated him, and I—" She stopped herself, realizing too late that she had said too much. The courtroom murmured again, and the judge banged the gavel for order. When it was Carl's turn to speak, his tone was measured, his arrogance still palpable. "I had no intention of harming my ex-wife," he said smoothly. "These accusations are absurd. My only concern was protecting my reputation." Jennifer stood, her voice calm, but cutting as she cross-examined him. "Protecting your reputation? By hiring someone to intimidate her? By spreading lies to discredit her book?" Carl didn't respond immediately, his jaw tightening. "Mr. Wheeler," Jennifer continued, "is it true that your abusive behavior toward Mrs. Wheeler was the subject of her novel?" "I never abused her," Carl snapped, his control slipping for the first time. "She's exaggerating everything, painting herself as a victim." Jennifer's gaze didn't waver. "And yet, multiple witnesses, including your own sister, have testified to your behavior. How do you explain that?" Carl's silence was damning. The verdict came quickly. "Carl Wheeler," the judge said, her voice firm, "the evidence presented leaves no doubt of your culpability. You are hereby sentenced to 5 years in prison for conspiracy to commit assault and harassment, with additional penalties for defamation." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Kelly's face was ashen, her once pristine reputation now irreparably tarnished by her complicity. Carl sat motionless, his carefully constructed facade finally shattered. Charlotte exhaled deeply, relief washing over her as the gavel struck. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing as Charlotte stepped into the bright afternoon light. Jennifer and Arthur flanked her, their presence grounding. "How do you feel now that Carl Wheeler has been sentenced?" a reporter shouted. Charlotte paused, her voice steady as she answered, "I feel free. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about reclaiming your voice, your life. And that's what I've done." Later that evening, Charlotte sat on her parents' porch, the quiet hum of the small town, a stark contrast to the chaos of the day. Arthur joined her, his expression calm but thoughtful. "You handled yourself well today," he said. Charlotte smiled faintly. "I had a lot of help." Arthur leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You're stronger than you think, Charlotte. Don't let anyone take that away from you." She looked at him, his quiet confidence a steadying presence. "Thank you, Arthur, for everything." He nodded, and they sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the past finally lifting. For the first time in years, Charlotte felt a sense of closure. Carl's actions had cost her so much, but she had survived, and she had won. Her future was her own again, and she was ready to embrace it. The soft hum of chatter filled the bookstore as readers gathered for Charlotte Wheeler's book signing. A banner hanging over the table read, "Finding the Light, a story of survival and strength," with her name printed prominently below. Charlotte sat behind the table, pen in hand, a steady stream of readers eagerly waiting for her signature. She met each of them with a smile, listening as they shared their stories. "Your book gave me the courage to leave," one woman whispered, her voice breaking as she clutched her copy to her chest. Charlotte reached across the table and placed a hand over hers. "You gave yourself that courage. Thank you for sharing your strength with me." As the event wrapped up, Charlotte looked at the long line of people still waiting and felt a wave of gratitude. Her story was no longer just hers. It had become a beacon for others. The next day, Charlotte met Jennifer and Arthur at a local community center. They were there to launch Voices Rising, an advocacy project aimed at supporting survivors of domestic abuse. The center buzzed with energy as volunteers set up booths and prepared materials. Jennifer stood near the entrance, her presence commanding as she briefed the team. Arthur was at the back, lifting boxes of pamphlets onto a table, his uniform lending a sense of security to the event. Charlotte joined him, rolling up her sleeves to help. "You don't have to do that," Arthur said, raising an eyebrow as she grabbed a box. "I insist," she replied, smiling. "You're not the only one with strength, officer." Arthur chuckled, shaking his head. Point taken. As they worked, Charlotte noticed how seamlessly they moved together. There was an ease in their interactions, a growing trust that felt as natural as breathing. The first panel discussion began with Jennifer addressing the crowd. She spoke about the importance of breaking cycles of abuse and providing resources for those in need. When it was Charlotte's turn, she stood at the podium, her heart pounding as she faced the audience. "I never thought I'd be here," she began, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "For years, I felt powerless, trapped in a life that didn't feel like my own. Writing my story was my way of reclaiming that life, but I never expected it to resonate with so many of you." She paused, meeting the eyes of the people sitting in the front rows. "You are not alone. Your voice matters. Your life matters. And together, we can create a world where no one has to feel the way I did." The applause was thunderous, but it was the tearful nods and quiet thank yous afterward that stayed with her. As the event wound down, Arthur approached her near the refreshments table, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You were incredible up there," he said, handing her one. Charlotte smiled, the warmth in his gaze making her feel lighter. "Thank you. It's still overwhelming sometimes." Arthur nodded. "That's what makes it real. You're not just helping others. You're showing them what survival looks like." Their conversation drifted to lighter topics as the night went on. Charlotte found herself laughing more than she had in years, the weight of her past growing fainter with each shared smile. The weeks that ensued were filled with a flurry of activities. Charlotte worked closely with Jennifer to expand Voices Rising, organizing workshops, fundraisers, and support groups. Arthur became an unofficial partner in their efforts, his presence at events reassuring both the team and the survivors they supported. As they spent more time together, Charlotte and Arthur's bond deepened. There was no rush, no pressure, just a steady, unspoken understanding. He didn't fill her silence with platitudes or try to fix her. He simply stood beside her, a quiet strength she could lean on when she needed it. One evening, after a particularly successful fundraiser, Charlotte and Arthur walked together through the quiet streets of her hometown. The autumn air was crisp, the leaves crunching underfoot as they strolled. "You've built something incredible," Arthur said, his voice thoughtful, "something lasting." Charlotte glanced at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Not just me, Jennifer, you, everyone who supported me. It's all of us." They stopped at a small park, the lamplight casting a soft glow over the benches. Charlotte sat down, and Arthur joined her, their shoulders brushing lightly. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the night wrapping around them like a blanket. Then Arthur turned to her, his expression earnest. "You've been through so much, Charlotte, but you've come out stronger, and seeing that, it's inspiring." She looked at him, the sincerity in his eyes making her chest ache in the best way. "I couldn't have done it alone," she admitted. "You didn't have to," he said simply. Charlotte smiled, the future stretching out before her like a blank page, waiting to be written. She felt ready to embrace it, not just for herself, but for everyone she could help along the way. Together, they sat under the stars, the weight of the past finally giving way to the promise of what was to come. The morning sky was just beginning to shift, the first rays of sunlight painting soft hues of gold and pink across the Dallas skyline. Charlotte stood on the balcony of her new apartment, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. The city below was quiet, its usual bustle momentarily at rest, as though the world itself was offering her a moment of peace. It's been 1 year since she divorced. She closed her eyes, letting the crisp air fill her lungs. It had been a long journey to this point, a journey marked by pain, fear, and ultimately, triumph. Charlotte's days were now filled with purpose. The success of finding the light had not only brought her financial independence, but also a platform to make real change. The Voices Rising initiative had grown beyond her expectations, with new chapters opening across the state and requests pouring in from other cities. At its heart was a simple mission: to empower survivors of abuse to reclaim their lives. Workshops, legal aid programs, and support groups were flourishing under the leadership of Charlotte, Jennifer, and their dedicated team. Arthur had become an integral part of the organization, his quiet but steadfast demeanor providing both safety and encouragement. One Saturday morning, Charlotte arrived at the community center for a Voices Rising event. The room was alive with energy, volunteers setting up tables, attendees mingling, and children playing in a corner designated as a safe space. Arthur greeted her at the door, his uniform traded for casual jeans and a button-down shirt. "You're here early," he noted, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "So are you," she replied, raising an eyebrow. He shrugged, handing her a clipboard. "You always need someone to carry these." Charlotte laughed, the sound light and easy. It was moments like these, simple, unforced, that reminded her of how far she had come. Later in the day, Charlotte sat at a round-table discussion with survivors who had found hope through Voices Rising. A young woman shared her story, her voice trembling at first, but growing steadier as she spoke. "I thought I'd never escape," the woman said, her eyes glistening with tears. "But then I read your book, Charlotte. It was like someone finally understood. It gave me the courage to leave." Charlotte reached across the table, squeezing the woman's hand. "You're the brave one. You chose to save yourself. And now, you're helping others do the same." The woman smiled, her shoulders straightening. That evening, as the event wound down, Arthur found Charlotte packing up pamphlets. "You've been on your feet all day," he said, gently taking the box from her hands. "And so have you," she countered. He set the box down and leaned against the table. "I mean it, Charlotte. What you're doing here, it's changing lives." Charlotte met his gaze, her heart swelling. "So are you, Arthur. You've been my anchor through all of this." His expression softened, his voice low. "It's easy to stand beside someone who inspires you." The weight of his words lingered between them, unspoken feelings hovering just beneath the surface. The next morning, Charlotte woke early. She brewed a pot of tea and stepped onto her balcony, the cool air brushing against her skin. The sunrise was breathtaking, its colors bleeding into one another like a masterpiece. She thought about the life she had left behind, the fear, the control, the loneliness. It felt like a distant memory now, a shadow that no longer defined her. Her phone buzzed on the table inside. It was a text from Arthur. "Coffee later?" She smiled, typing back a quick response. "Always." As she set the phone down, Charlotte leaned against the railing, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She thought about the survivors she had met, the lives she had touched, and the people who had stood by her: Jennifer, Martha, her parents, and Arthur. For the first time in years, she felt whole. Her scars were still there, but they were no longer wounds. They were proof of her strength, a map of her journey. The world below was waking up, and so was she. As the sun climbed higher, Charlotte whispered to herself, "I'm ready." The past no longer held her captive, and the future stretched out before her, full of promise. She had reclaimed her life, her voice, and her purpose, and now she was ready to embrace whatever came next. With the sunrise lighting her path, Charlotte stepped inside, confident in her ability to face it all. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining. See you there.